Machiavelli sits warning how power rewards the unwise. There's a quiet humiliation that thoughtful people often feel when they look at the world, a sense that something is deeply upside down. We see leaders who are loud, reckless, and curious rise to the top, while those who think carefully, who carry doubts, who genuinely ask what is right, they hesitate, stay silent, or are ignored altogether. Why is it, we ask, that the most foolish people, or worse, the most manipulative, so often end up in power? This isn't just a modern problem, it's not new, and it's not rare. In fact, history seems to repeat this pattern again and again. Plato warned that democracies could be seduced by charming tyrants. Machiavelli, writing 5 centuries ago, didn't just acknowledge this phenomenon, he explained why it happens, and why, unless we understand it, it will keep happening. And maybe you have felt this in your own life too, in a job, a school, a community where the least qualified, least self aware person somehow takes control, while the one with quiet wisdom stands aside, disillusioned, thinking, how did this happen? It creates a kind of moral injury, because deep down we want the world to reward virtue, not cunning. But when reality betrays that hope, we either become cynical or we look deeper. In this video, we're going to look deeper. We'll explore 6 core insights drawn from classical philosophy, modern psychology, and real human experience to understand why foolish people so often rise to power and what wise people can do about it. This isn't about armchair outrage. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's not even really about politics. It's steps about power in every form, in families, in workplaces, in nations, in relationships. And it's about the human mind, our biases, our fears, our hunger for order, and the tragic way we often mistake confidence for competence. By the end of this journey, you may not just see power differently, you may start to see yourself differently too. Let's begin. There's a strange moment that happens in group discussions, maybe in a classroom, a team meeting, or even among friends debating some issue. A question is raised. It's complex, layered, maybe even unanswerable, and someone immediately speaks up with total certainty. Here steps what it is. First is obvious. They speak smoothly, forcefully, no hesitation, no nuance. And then someone else, maybe quieter, maybe wiser, hesitates. They begin with, well, it depends, or that SEP's complicated. And just like that, the room tilts toward the confident voice, not necessarily because it's correct, but because it feels like leadership. Why do we fall for this? This is the illusion of confidence, and it may be the single most reliable way that foolish or unqualified people rise to power, because humans don't just seek truth. We seek relief from uncertainty. We seek emotional stability. And confidence, even false confidence, gives us that. Cognitive psychologists call this the confidence heuristic, our brain's tendency to assume that someone who speaks with certainty must be more competent. But this is a bias, a trick of perception, not a reflection of reality. In fact, research consistently shows that the people who know less tend to be more confident in their opinions, while the people who know more are often less certain. This is known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, a cognitive distortion where ignorance breeds overconfidence and expertise breeds humility. Socrates understood this 2,400 years ago. In Plato's best dialogues, Socrates walks the streets of Athens, questioning generals, politicians, poets, and discovers something startling. The more someone claims to know, the less they truly understand. And the wisest people, ironically, are those who admit what they don't know. As he famously put it, I know that I know nothing. But how does this translate to power? In moments of fear, crisis, or confusion, people don't usually follow the most reasonable voice. They follow the clearest one, the loudest one, the one that pretends to have answers. This is why demagogues thrive in times of uncertainty. That's why conspiracy theories flourish. It's why strongman leaders, whether in politics or in personal life, can rise so quickly because we stir not just choosing ideas, we thirst choosing emotional shelter. This has implications far beyond politics. In workplaces, those who speak confidently in meetings, even when they're wrong, are often promoted faster. In relationships, those who express certainty are often trusted more than those who express ambivalence. Even in parenting, children often gravitate to the parent who offers firmness, not necessarily thoughtfulness. So, what do we do with this? It's not enough to scold ourselves for being biased. We have to consciously unlearn the habit of equating confidence with competence. That starts with ourselves. Ask, when do I reward confidence more than thoughtfulness? Whose voices do I dismiss because they don't sound sure enough? Do I silence my own voice because I worry it's not certain enough? Because here steps the quiet tragedy. Many brilliant, caring people stay on the sidelines, not because they don't have insights, but because they don't trust their delivery. They don't want to oversimplify. They don't so want to manipulate. They see complexity, and so they hesitate. But if only the foolish speak with confidence, then only the foolish get heard. Socrates teaches us something radical, that admitting uncertainty isn't weakness, it's wisdom. But wisdom must learn to speak in a voice that others can hear. So the next time someone speaks with total certainty, pause. Ask yourself not just, do I agree? But also, do they really know? And if you feel unsure, don't be ashamed of it. Let that doubt become part of your strength, because truth doesn't stick shout. It speaks, often quietly, from the edge of awareness. Will we learn to listen? There's a particular kind of pain that comes from seeing something clearly and saying nothing. You notice the cracks forming in an organization, a relationship, a society. You sense that something is wrong, deeply wrong. And yet, when the moment comes to speak, you hesitate. Why? The easy answer is fear. Fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of conflict. But beneath that is something subtler and even more tragic, conscience. The wisest people often see too much. They don't act rashly, not because they're cowards, but because they're moral. They understand the weight of consequences. They imagine the unintended effects, and so they hesitate. In a world that rewards action, they reflect. In a culture that prizes boldness, they dwell in nuance. Søren Kierkegaard, the 19th century Danish philosopher, called this the dizziness of freedom. He wrote about the terrifying burden of choice, how self aware people, when faced with real moral responsibility, are paralyzed not by weakness, but by depth. To act wisely, Kierkegaard believed, you must first understand yourself, and that self understanding can be overwhelming. It saps the inner voice that whispers, what if I've been wrong? What if I make things worse? What if I am not the one to fix this? So the person who should speak doesn't set, and into that silence steps someone far less thoughtful, far more certain. This is what I call the courage deficit, not a lack of intelligence, not a lack of vision, but a lack of existential boldness, the willingness to carry one's insight into action, knowing it might go wrong. There's a psychological principle that helps explain this too. It's called pluralistic ignorance, a phenomenon where everyone privately doubts what's happening, but assumes everyone else agrees. So no one speaks. It's the silent classroom where everyone is confused, but no one raises their hand. The toxic workplace where everyone sees the dysfunction, but no one challenges the leader. The political moment where everyone senses decay, but waits for someone else to act. This silence is not accidental, it is systemic, because thoughtful people often outsource boldness to the reckless. They assume someone else, louder, braver, more extroverted, will handle it. But here sips the uncomfortable truth. If the wise don't speak, the unwise will. If the kind don't lead, the cruel will. If the reflective don't rise, the arrogant will take the throne. There is no vacuum of power, only a vacuum of courage. So, what would it mean to change that? Not to become brash, but to become bravely humble, to speak, not because you're certain, but because you care, to act, not because you know all the answers, but because the silence is doing damage. One of the most powerful moments in moral history was when Socrates, on trial for his life, stood before the Athenian jury and refused to abandon his principles. He could have saved himself by apologizing, by flattering the judges, by playing the political game. But he didn't set. He said, "The unexamined life is not worth living," and he died for it. Now, we are not all called to be martyrs, but we are called to resist the cowardice that silence can become, because silence, over time, shapes culture. When the wise retreat from leadership, whether in families, companies, or countries, the culture follows the voices that remain. So here is the question we must ask ourselves: what am I avoiding by being quiet? And deeper still, what responsibility have I silently abandoned just because I was afraid of being wrong? Courage is not loud. It is not without fear. It is the quiet decision to stand up anyway. If more thoughtful people did that, even just once, the world would look very different. A gentle reminder: if this exploration resonates with you, consider subscribing. We explore these kinds of questions every week, not with easy answers, but with deep inquiry and reflection. In 1513, a disgraced diplomat sat in exile, having fallen out of favor with the rulers of Florence. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli, and in his forced solitude, he wrote a small, explosive book that would change the way we think about power forever. The book was The Prince, a brutally honest guide for rulers. But Machiavelli wasn't trying to write a moral treatise. He wasn't interested in how power should work. He wanted to reveal how it actually works. And what he found was unsettling: that ruthlessness often outperforms virtue. We don't like to admit this. We want to believe that good people will rise, that justice prevails, that character matters. But Machiavelli held up a mirror to the political world and said, essentially, if you want to win power and keep it, you must understand how people really behave, not how they should behave. And people, he observed, are not always noble. They are driven by fear, by self interest, by the need for order and the appearance of strength. So the leader who succeeds is not always the most just, but the one who understands human weakness most clearly. He writes, "It is much safer to be feared than loved, if you must choose." This is not a recommendation. It sets a diagnosis. Machiavelli was one of the first political thinkers to separate morality from power, to show that ethical virtue and political success are often at odds. And this helps explain our central question: why do foolish or even dangerous people rise to power? Because they are willing to do what wise people often aren't. They lie boldly. They promise certainty. They exploit fears. They don't burden themselves with nuance or ethical hesitation. And in a world where people crave order, where complexity is exhausting, and where trust is fragile, that kind of bold manipulation works. This isn't just ancient theory. It's alive today. You see it in politicians who weaponize culture wars, in CEOs who cut corners and call it innovation, in influencers who sell certainty dressed as empowerment. They understand something Machiavelli understood. That image often matters more than truth. That perception management is as important as reality, and that people will often choose a strong lie over a fragile truth. But before we condemn Machiavelli, we have to remember he wasn't cheering this on. He was warning us. He believed that republics, that is, free societies, could only survive if citizens understood how power truly operated. He was, in a way, trying to inoculate us, to teach us how to see through the illusions. But to do that, we have to let go of our naivete. We must stop assuming that the rise of the foolish is always a fluke, or that the unqualified succeed despite their behavior. Often, they succeed because of it. They know how to play the game. They know that people respond more to dominance than to dialogue, that fear moves crowds more easily than inspiration, and that once someone appears powerful, people start to believe they deserve it. So, where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice. We can either withdraw in moral disgust, or we can learn how power moves, learn how to spot the performance behind the persona, and maybe even learn how to act within that system without losing our soul. Because the antidote to Machiavellianism isn't naivety, it's strategic wisdom. It's the ability to understand the dark mechanics of power and choose a different way. Machiavelli once said, "A wise man ought always to follow the paths beaten by great men, and to imitate those who have been supreme." But maybe our job today is not to imitate the powerful, but to understand them clearly enough that we are no longer fooled by them. Because when we see clearly, we are harder to control. And that too is a kind of power. There's something strange that happens when we enter a group, a classroom, a protest, a stadium, even an online forum. We become less ourselves. Not necessarily in a bad way, but in a way that changes how we think, how we feel, and especially how we decide. We take on the emotional temperature of the crowd. We lose some of our inner compass and replace it with an external one. What does everyone else believe? Who is leading? Who do we trust or fear? And in that moment, complexity becomes dangerous because groups, especially large or emotionally charged ones, don't like uncertainty. They want clarity, simplicity, certainty, and above all, they want a target. This is the shadow of the group, and it explains why foolish or dangerous people so often rise to power in collective settings. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst, warned us that when we enter a mass movement, we often regress. The individual ego dissolves into the group identity. We become suggestible, reactive, easily led by myth, symbol, and archetype. And who knows how to wield these things best? Not the philosopher, not the careful moral thinker, but the demagogue, the one who speaks in absolutes, who names enemies, who gives the group a story that feels good, whether or not it's true. And in that dynamic, the foolish can thrive because they do not burden the group with nuance. They give it direction, certainty, energy, all the things that in the heat of the moment feel more valuable than wisdom. Thomas Hobbes, centuries earlier, saw this in a different way. In his book Leviathan, he argued that in the state of nature, human beings are driven by fear, survival, and the need for order. To escape chaos, we form groups, governments, tribes, churches, and in doing so, we often surrender our judgment to the group's leader. We don't want to think for ourselves. We want someone to think for us. This is not weakness. It is a survival instinct, but it can be exploited. And it explains why people who are confident but wrong so often outpace those who are thoughtful but cautious, especially in public. Because when people are scared, or tired, or overwhelmed, they choose what feels right, not what is right. They choose the simple story. We see this all around us. A nation in economic distress follows a leader who promises to make it great again. A company in crisis listens to a CEO who blames everything on bad culture and then fires half the staff. A friend group under strain rallies around the loudest voice, even if it's the least fair, because the group doesn't want truth. It wants cohesion, and that cohesion often comes at the cost of depth. So, what can we do? First, we must recognize when we are being pulled into the group's shadow. Ask yourself, am I thinking clearly, or am I being swept away? Do I believe this because I've thought it through, or because everyone else seems to? Am I following wisdom or charisma? Second, we must learn to speak complexity into simplicity. This doesn't mean dumbing things down. It means finding the courage and the skill to translate deep truth into language the group can hear. Because if only the foolish know how to rally a crowd, then only the foolish will lead it. We must not abandon the public square to simplicity's loudest preachers. We must enter it carefully, wisely, but firmly, and offer something better, a different kind of clarity, one that doesn't erase the truth to comfort the crowd, but that respects people enough to tell them the whole story, because the group will always be vulnerable to its shadow. But someone must be the one to light the torch. We like to believe that the world is fair, or at least fair enough, that if someone rises to power, they must have earned it, that if someone becomes rich, famous, influential, they must be brilliant, or hardworking, or deserving, that merit will eventually be recognized. This belief comforts us. It makes the world feel predictable, but it's a myth, and like all myths, it distorts reality in subtle but devastating ways. Because when we look closely at how power actually moves through systems, political, economic, corporate, even academic, we begin to see a troubling pattern. Systems don't reward merit, they reward traits that the system values, which may have nothing to do with wisdom or virtue. Michel Foucault, the French philosopher and historian, spent much of his life analyzing how power operates beneath the surface of modern institutions. He argued that we often mistake individual success for moral worth, without realizing that institutions are designed to normalize certain behaviors, reward conformity, and punish deviation. Power does instead just reside in laws or rulers. It lives in bureaucracies, in job descriptions, in cultural expectations. It flows through systems that reward people who play the game, even if that game is corrupt. This helps explain why foolish or harmful people often rise. They may not be the best, but they are often the best at navigating the system as it exists. They self promote without shame. They play politics. They manipulate appearances. They learn how to be legible to the algorithm, the hiring committee, the electorate, not necessarily how to be good. Karl Marx saw something similar, though through a different lens. He argued that the ruling class didn't rise because they were morally superior, but because they controlled the means of production. In other words, their power wasn't earned through merit, it was structural. And unless you change the structure, the same kinds of people will keep ending up on top. So, what does this mean for us? It means we need to let go of the idea that good outcomes are always deserved and bad ones always earned. We need to look more deeply at the mechanisms behind status, success, and leadership. Because when we assume that the cream rises to the top, we stop questioning why the same kinds of people, loud, self assured, performative, keep appearing in leadership again and again. The truth is, our systems often reward charisma over character, aggression over empathy, certainty over curiosity, visibility over substance. And once we internalize the myth of merit, we don't just tolerate this, we start to blame ourselves when we don't succeed in the same way. We tell ourselves we must not be trying hard enough, that our reluctance to self promote is a weakness, that our moral hesitation is naivete, that maybe was it just not leadership material, but maybe, just maybe, the system is miscalibrated, and maybe what it rewards isn't merit, but performance. So, what can be done? First, we must become conscious of the structures we're part of. Ask, what behaviors does this system reward? What does it punish? And who benefits from that design? Second, we must create alternate spaces, places where different values rise to the top, where listening matters more than dominance, where reflection is honored, where people don't have to posture or perform to be heard. These spaces wouldn't be easy to build, but they are essential because the default systems will always select for traits that keep themselves intact. And finally, we must stop confusing power with worth. Someone's position, whether high or low, does not define their value, nor does your own. Merit may not always rise, but it doesn't disappear. It waits quietly for the moment it is needed. And when that moment comes, will you be ready? At some point in your life, you've probably stood at the edge of something unjust. You've seen someone speak dishonestly in a meeting and get rewarded for it. You've watched a friend manipulate others and face no consequence. You've read headlines about leaders failing upward, rewarded for recklessness, shielded by power. And you felt that sickening mixture of frustration and helplessness. You witnessed it, but you didn't stop it. And maybe, just maybe, you told yourself what most good people do in these moments. Accept's not my place. Someone else will speak up. Accept's not worth the conflict. That's just how the world works. These thoughts are understandable. but they are also dangerous. Because when the wise only watch, the foolish don't just rise, they reign. This is what I call the responsibility of the witness. That moment when you see clearly what's happening and realize that your silence is no longer neutral. Philosophers like Camus and Sartre wrestled with this in the ashes of World War II. They saw what happened when entire societies became passive observers, when people told themselves, I stem just one person, I can sit change this. And yet the moral weight of history fell on them. Existentialism, at its core, teaches that meaning isn't given to us, we create it through our actions. And that responsibility begins in the moment of seeing. To witness something unjust and say nothing is to quietly affirm it, not because you agree, but because systems interpret silence as consent. Even in your own life, this is true. When someone dominates the room and you don't challenge them, it emboldens them. When someone spreads misinformation and you stay quiet, it spreads faster. When someone abuses power and you walk away, they grow stronger. And meanwhile, you carry the weight of having seen it but done nothing. But here steps the thing. The responsibility of the witness isn't about perfection. It's not about rushing into every battle or moralizing every conversation. It's steps about learning to respond, not retreat. To realize that awareness comes with a quiet obligation to speak, to question, to model a different way of being. This might mean asking the question no one else wants to ask, standing by someone who sits being dismissed, naming the manipulation that others ignore, gently challenging a false narrative, even when it costs you comfort. And yes, it may cost you comfort. You may not be liked. You may not be applauded. You may even lose something, an opportunity, a relationship, a sense of safety. But you will gain something deeper, integrity, a clearer conscience, and the knowledge that you didn't abandon your insight, because insight without courage becomes regret. There's a quiet kind of leadership the world is desperate for, not flashy, not performative, not drenched in ego, but the kind that sees what's broken and chooses to respond anyway. This is the wisdom of the witness, the one who sees clearly, speaks carefully, and acts with grounded resolve. The one who says, I may not change everything, but I won't sit, let this moment pass without offering something better. In the end, it's not always about stopping the rise of the foolish. Sometimes it's about refusing to be part of their silence, because that silence is where their power begins. And your voice, even if it shakes, is where something else begins. We began with a hard question, one you, Steph, probably felt deep in your bones. Why do the most foolish people so often end up in power? Now, after walking through history, psychology, and philosophy, the answer is both clearer and more difficult. It's not because foolish people are always more talented. It's stats not because they set are chosen by fate. It's because they're willing to do what others won't. Claim certainty, court attention, perform strength, and play the game without shame. And it's because those who see clearly often stay silent, not out of weakness, but out of conscience. So the world tilts, not toward wisdom, but toward visibility, not toward merit, but toward manipulation, not toward truth, but toward simplicity and spectacle. We live in that tilted world, but we do not have to accept it. Let's revisit the 6 insights we explored. The illusion of confidence. We mistake loud certainty for strength, while true wisdom speaks more quietly, with humility. The courage deficit. The thoughtful often hesitate, not because they don't care, but because they care too much and feel the weight of consequence. Machiavelli's mirror. Those who rise often understand power's dark machinery better than the rest, not because they're wise, but because they're strategic. The shadow of the group. In crowds, we reward the simplest story, the boldest claim, the clearest enemy, and we forget how to think. The myth of merit. Systems don't reward the best, they reward what the system values, and it may not be truth, empathy, or depth. The responsibility of the witness. Once we see the pattern, we can no longer say, "This isn't my problem." Silence, too, is a decision. These insights are heavy. They unsettle us, but they also open something possibility. Because once we understand the pattern, we can begin to disrupt it, not with outrage or noise, but with a quieter kind of rebellion. A rebellion of the thoughtful, the humble, the morally serious, the ones who no longer wait to be invited, who speak before they feel fully ready, who show up even when they stare not sure how. You don't need to run for office or start a revolution, but you do need to stop pretending your insight doesn't matter. Maybe your voice won't shit, change the world, but it might change the room you start in. And sometimes that's enough. The world does instead need more influencers. It needs more integrity, more people who understand power but refuse to abuse it, who understand the game but choose to play differently. That's bees you, or at least it could be. The next time a foolish voice rises, not just in politics, but in your workplace, your family, your friend group, ask, is this the moment I've been waiting for? The one where I stop being a witness and start being a force? Because you don't need to be perfect. You just need to show up as someone who sees clearly and still dares to act. Let the foolish chase power. Let the arrogant play their games. You be something else. Be the one who walks into the room and says the thing that needed saying. The one who makes power pause. The one who shows that clarity, conscience, and courage still exist. That is the quiet rebellion of the wise, and its steps long overdue. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing. We explore questions like this every week, slowly, deeply, without noise. And if this stirred something in you, share it, not to spread my words, but to spread your own awakening. You are not alone. We stare thinking through the dark together, and that is its own kind of power.